Hey everybody, welcome back to the Dialogue Doctor this week. Before we jump into the material this week, we're talking about using dialogue to communicate character growth. I want to talk a little bit about what's happening in the community, which you can expect this week, and then also I want to give a couple disclaimers. So let's start with the disclaimer. First, it's been since May since I did since I did a solo episode, so it's been a while. And yeah, it's been tough doing this. So I just want to give an explainer up front. I am a little out of practice. I'm a little rusty. So bear with me. Second explainer, disclaimer, not explainer, disclaimer. Second disclaimer is that this is new material. So I've been writing the Dialogue Doctor book, How to Write Dialogue. I started it really in earnest, started it in October. And I am almost done with the first draft. I just have a little bit left to write. So I'm gonna finish the first draft. I'll have it out early in 2023, which I'm very excited about. I got to format and edit because it's not just a book, it's going to have kind of a workbook feel to it. So I'm very pumped about that. And this material comes from a chapter I wrote. Um, and so this is the first time I've presented it. So if I'm a little rambly, a little off on it, I'm not as tight as a presentation as I usually am. Forgive me for that. I'm sorry. I'm a little rambly on it. Last disclaimer you should know is that in writing the book, I've really had to question some of the phrases I use and some of the things I say. Um, I find myself using a lot of terminology that I then immediately have to explain. And it's not good terminology if I have to explain it right away. So you're going to get a taste in this presentation of the way that I'm going to be changing some of the ways that I talk about things. The content is all the same. It's just the terms that I'm using, I'm going to design a little bit better. That until I started writing it, I didn't realize like this is silly. It's silly for me to say this thing and then immediately have to define it. So yeah, we're going to try to improve all of that. And this talk will be your first glimpse of that kind of change in language. So that's the disclaimer. Let's talk about what's going on this week in the world of the Dialogue Doctor. There are slides to this talk. If you're listening to the podcast and not watching on YouTube, you won't be able to see the slides, but every time I give one of these, people are like, hey, can I have a copy of those slides? You can have a copy of those slides. There's a newsletter that it's totally free. It comes out every Tuesday, sometimes Wednesday, depending on the amount of crazy week I have. I do this in my spare time. I do have a day job. So depending on the amount of crazy I have there, sometimes it comes out on Wednesday. But there's a newsletter that comes out 9 times out of 10. You can go to dialoguedoctor.com, find it under the learning button. You can subscribe to it there. That's also where you can find all the podcast episodes as well if you want to go back and listen to old podcast episodes, because I'm going to reference a couple today. So yeah, go to the learning button in the menu of dialoguedoctor.com and you can find the free weekly newsletter there. While you're there, come check out our community as well. You can click on the community button on dialoguedoctor.com, or you can go to patreon.com/Jeff Elkins. In the newsletter, I'm going to send out the slides. In the community, if you subscribe for $8 a month, I do a bonus episode every week. And this week in the bonus episode, I'm going to take the books that we've done in book club over the past couple of years, and I'm going to show what I'm teaching today, how it's used in those books. So you can kind of connect to stories that we know as a community. You can connect to those. You can connect these ideas I'm talking about in those stories. You don't have to subscribe to $8 a month. You can also subscribe to $5 a month. $5 a month gets you membership into our Slack group, which is amazing. It's a group of authors all working together to improve our dialogue and engage readers on a deeper level. We have 2 Zoom meetings a month. One where we kind of do Q&A, or we talk about a specific topic. Those are incredible. And then a second one is usually our book club. Once a month. And then we also do a weekly writing prompt on Tuesdays. Those have taken on, they've changed recently, take on a month-long theme. And then you also get 20% off of all Dialogue Doctor workshops. So that's for $5 a month. I know money's tight right now. So I actually held off on doing a masterclass this month because everybody's just really struggling with money. I get it. It's rough out there, y'all. So I get it. So if you can't afford $5 a month, please know I don't harbor you any ill will. At the same time, if you like what I do and you enjoy this exploration of dialogue that we've been doing now for 2.5 years, I would love your support. That's just an easy way to support me. Okay, so let's get to the topic at hand. Today we're talking about using dialogue to communicate character growth. Yeah, character growth is one of those weird things that we talk about all the time. We know our characters need to grow. We're constantly told your character needs to grow, your character needs to change, but we don't really ever define how. We're just like, so make it happen, right? Like magic, make it grow. So today, what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about what character growth is, hopefully give you a different way to see what character growth is. And then I'm going to give you 3 tools to use that you can use to express, that you can communicate that character growth. And then we're going to bring it all together and talk about how your character growth and the shape of your story align. So those are our goals today. I'm not sure how long this talk is going to go. I have given it a couple times to practice it, and it was about 45 minutes, but you turn on the camera and I might talk. So there's no telling how long it's going to happen. So just go with me, people. All right, character growth. That's probably the last time you're going to hear me say the phrase character growth. I don't like the phrase character growth because it implies a net positive. It implies that your character is going to change in a positive way throughout the story, and that may not necessarily be true. So we're going to talk about character change. And I actually want to back up a little bit. And first, I want to talk about time. So, and specifically your storyline. So your storyline is just time. It is time of your story. I have this place. We've lived in my wife and I and our kids have lived in a lot of different places. We've been in this house for 8 years, which is the longest we've ever been in one house. And we have this wall in every house we live in, but it's upstairs. We'll find a corner that's, easy to stand next to. And we will put pencil marks on the wall as to how high the kids are. And then we'll write next to the pencil, how tall the kids are. And we'll write next to the pencil mark, like, feet and inches and their name and how old they are. And they love it because if you go look at the wall, you can literally like see their rate of growth, how much they've changed. And that's what time is. Time is a measurement of change. A lot of times I get confused and I think of time as units. I think of like, oh, what is time? Time is minutes, seconds, hours, days, months, weeks, years. I know I did those out of order. That's just how the brain works. See, this is why this is gonna be longer than 45 minutes because I can't stay on topic. So those are the units of time. Those are not the content of time. What time is measuring with those units is change. Just like when you look at the wall where my kid's height has grown and changed, you can see how it's changing over time, right? Or if I were to ask you, talk to me about your life 5 years ago. 5 years ago, 5 years in the past is the measurement. What it is measuring is how different your life is between now and then. And that's where you'd start, most likely, is you'd start by telling me what was different in your life 5 years ago. If I were to say like, hey, what do you think life is going to be like in 20 years? You're going to start telling me what changes you think will happen because that 20 years is a measure of change. This goes like way deeper. I'm scratching the surface on what time is, and we don't need to, for our purposes today, talking about your storyline and how time is a measurement of change, how your storyline is a measurement of change. We don't need to go any deeper into it, but if you are interested in thinking about time as a measure of change, I recommend this book, The Order of Time by Carlo Rovelli. It's beautifully written. It's very very deep and at the same time very easy to understand. And the audiobook is just a gorgeous read. So yeah, highly recommend it if you want to get deeper into time. But as we're thinking about the time or the line of your story, what's happening in your story, we're thinking about how your character is changing. And again, we talk about this as character growth, but growth applies a positive. So we're going to keep with character change. We've got your character at the beginning of your story and the character at the end of your story. And from the beginning to the end, there should be change. It doesn't mean that change needs to be a net positive or a net negative. The change might be a net neutral, but there needs to be change. And I'll talk more about net neutral change at the end of this session. So if you're like, well, the Jack Reacher doesn't change, hang on till the end. We'll talk about that. So we've got character at the beginning, character at the end, and change happening all throughout the middle of the story. As you think about that character changing at the beginning and the end, there's two things to consider: theme and flaw. So typically, how your character changes is going to line up with your theme. So, for example, if you want your theme to be, if you're going to be Kafka, and you want your theme to be the redundancies and agony of bureaucracy, then your character needs to become increasingly frustrated with bureaucracy throughout the story. So we're going to start with a character that feels neutral about bureaucracy, and we're going to end with a character that has a net negative feeling about bureaucracy, and the character will change in their feelings about bureaucracy, right? Like the change of the character ties in to the theme you want to write. Or let's say the theme you're uncovering is chasing your dreams, and your character is a water farmer on a desert planet. And he has the dream of being a starfighter for the rebellion, right? Throughout the story, we're going to see this character ideally be challenged to become that Jedi starfighter. I'm talking about the original Star Wars, to become that Jedi starfighter, and we're going to see him challenged to grow into that role, to change into that net positive role of being the hero he longs to be at the beginning, right? So whatever your theme is, so if your theme is the pain and struggles of slavery, and you really want to look at the horrors of slavery, ideally your characters from the start, your character Sethi from the start of the book to the end of the book is going to change in her outward expression and through her memories and through the ghost that is haunting her in her expression of that past suffering, right? So change through the story. Your character starts the story one way, ends the story another. Ideally, that change centers around whatever themes it is you're discussing. We also want that change to center on your character's flaw. So, and this is just doing yourself a favor as a writer. You're gonna have a net positive or a net negative. It's helpful if you start with a character that is in need of change. So if you're going to write a net negative story where your character is going to go from riches to rags, the character is going to be happy and famous and have everything they want, they're super confident, and then at the end of the story, we really want to see a character that's been torn down to nothing and is suffering and sad, right? Start the character, if you're going to take that trajectory, start the character at a positive place. It gives you room to go, right? If you're going to make your character into a brave Jedi warrior who uses the Force to destroy the starship, don't give them the Force at the beginning of the story, because you don't have anywhere for your character to change. So this idea of thinking about your character's flaw, again, flaw has a negative connotation to it. What we're thinking about is start the story where your character, so that your character has room for change. Wherever you want your character to change, start the story at that place where your character has room for change. It just helps you as the author. It's just good for you as the author to do that. So we want our change to be connected somehow to the themes that we want to write about, and then we want our change to also we want to start the story with our character in a place where they're going to be able to change. right? Where they're going to be able to move. So another thing we need to think about when we think about the time of our story and our characters change throughout the story is we need to think about how that character is going to change. Now, for most stories, I'm going to give this caveat and then I'll come back and completely erase the caveat in a minute. But to start off the caveat, for most stories, we don't know when we start the story how the character is going to end. We might have a hint, but we're unsure, right? The character could go positive or the character could go negative. Positive and negative depends on what your theme is and how the change is coming about. Notice I'm using positive and negative and not like specific terms. So the character might have a net positive change or a net negative change. The reader doesn't know. That's part of what keeps the reader engaged, is they're excited about going on this journey with your vehicle character. If you don't know what I mean when I say vehicle, go look at older episodes for when I talk about VEA, vehicle engines, anchors, and hazards. But they're going to start off with your vehicle character. That's the character that your reader is traveling through the story with. If it's first person POV, it's going to be that POV. If you have multiple POVs, you'll have multiple vehicles. If you're third person, the vehicle is going to be the character that your reader experiences the most often, mostly. So your character, that's more complicated. Go listen to that episode. Don't just, yeah, I'm getting distracted. So as your character changes, we're going to have a net positive or negative. We don't know where the change is going to end at the ending, which keeps us engaged. And so as the character is changing throughout the story, we're going to want to see dips into both sides. We want to see the worst version of themselves, and we want to see the best version of themselves. We want to know what the possibilities are to change. We want to see them, if the story is going to have a net positive, we want to see them fail and become the worst versions of themselves at times. And if the story is going to be a net negative, right, like where they're going to end at that negative, then we want to see them have glimpses of the positive version of themselves. Because offering the readers these options of the positive and negative versions of a character helps the reader imagine what's possible for the character and change, and opens up the end of the story for the reader. So the reader can be like, oh, I can see where this can go, right? Like you're empowering the reader to go along the emotional journey of change with your character over the time of your story. So just know that as your character's changing, that we want to experience some positive change. We want to experience some negative change so we kind of see we can feel the different versions of the character. Now, there are going to be some stories where you already know where the character's going. Specifically, I think of like Cruella, which was a recent story on Disney Plus. Some people ask me, this is an aside, but some people ask me why I use movies and TV so often instead of literature as examples. And it's because we're living in a golden age of movies and TV, specifically of streaming. And it's just a lot more accessible for people than if I'm like referencing, A Man Called Ove, which is a book I've read, but not a lot of people, like the percentage of people that have read that book is far less than the percentage of people who have Disney Plus and the percentage of people who could watch Cruella. So yeah, I'm just using common examples. That down to the side. Back to Cruella. So we know who Cruella is going to be at the end of the story. We know at the end of the story, Cruella is going to be Cruella de Vil, who in 101 Dalmatians is going to kidnap puppies to turn into jackets. Right? We know that at the end she's the villain of the story. So the work for the author of the Cruella story becomes more difficult because the reader knows where Cruella's starting. They see the first of the show. They know where Cruella's ending. So then the big question becomes, how do they get there? Now, really good authors will put that net start and that net end at opposite ends of the spectrum. So if Cruella's ending in a negative where she's a villain, we're going to start her up here as majorly sympathetic. And then we're watching the journey into the negative where she has moments of positivity and moments of negativity, which we'll get into more at the end. But just know that there are no rules. And you'll hear me say this all the time. There are no rules for what you do with your story. You're an artist and writing is an art. Storytelling is an art. But there are expectations. So your reader's showing up to the book with expectations. And if you defy the expectations, meaning you break what the reader expects from a story, the reader expects coming into a story not to know what the ending is, right? The reader may have a glimpse, They know Sherlock Holmes is going to solve the mystery, right? But they don't know how he's going to solve the mystery. And so they're coming in with a glimpse of what it is. But if you defy that expectation where you're at the beginning, you're like, don't worry, Sherlock solves this one. Don't worry, Cruella is going to be evil at the end. If you're coming in defying that expectation, then your work is a little bit harder to keep the reader engaged in the middle, right? There are no rules, but there are expectations. And if you break expectations, you just make your job harder keeping the reader engaged in your story. And that's true for not knowing the character at the end. It's true in a whole bunch of other places that we'll talk about today. But to get back on track and to summarize, back to our main, uh, we've got our character at the beginning of the story, the character at the end of the story. It helps if they don't know where the character is at the end of the story, but if they do, that's okay. You just got to work harder in the middle to keep the reader engaged with the emotional twists and turns of character change that's going to excite the reader and trouble the reader. We want the best version of the character sometimes, and we want to see the worst version of the character sometimes, so that we have that fear, like that we don't know, like, oh, this is where this is going from the beginning, that we can see like this is what the best version looks like, and I would love for the character to become that, but the character may not. I'm scared the character might go to the worst version themselves. So we've got that up and down, right? Like we're giving both options, ideally tying it into the theme and helping ourselves out. If Cruella is going to be evil in the end, start her super sympathetic at the beginning, right? Like, yeah. Okay, so last thing we need to know about the kind of the philosophy of change, and then we're going to get into the mechanics of change. Last thing we need to know about philosophy of change is that the timeline of your story, just like the story of my kid's height growth, is broken into years and months, right? Like my son Jude, 4 months ago, was about a foot shorter than he is now. He has grown that much in like 4 months. So that growth can be broken out into growth over each month. In the same way, your character's change is broken out into a sequence of scenes. Let me say that again. Your character's change is broken out into a sequence of scenes. So if years are measured by months, your story's timeline is measured by scenes. Each scene is a unit of measure of change of your character. So when a scene passes, your character changes a little bit. And the next scene, your character changes a little bit. And the next scene, your character changes a little bit. The next scene, your character changes a little bit. As we line all those scenes up, we start to get the shape of your character's change, right? Maybe your character has 4 or 5 scenes where they change in a negative way, where they're showing the worst version of themselves. And then something happens that's really dramatic, and your character suddenly changes to the best version of themselves. Right. And they give us a glimpse of like, oh, this is what a positive version of this character looks like. But then they're right back down to the negative. Right. So your story is a sequence of scenes, one after the other. And I know that sounds basic, but we just don't often think of story that way. We think of story in like the big picture, like, okay, this is going to be my theme, but we don't ever break it down into the measurement of scenes and think about like, so one scene to the next is actually the measure of how my character is changing. Something else you need to know about these scenes, they are not created equal. So big emotional turns have a bigger impact on the reader's engagement with your character. So a big climactic scene, a big scene where everything fails and everything goes wrong, your reader's going to remember those more and they're going to engage with your character in a deeper way. At the beginning of your story, your reader's going to engage with your character in a deeper way. And at the end of your story, your reader's going to engage with the character in a deeper way. Why the beginning and the end? Because that's just how our brains work. My preaching teacher used to tell us all the time, hey, if you're going to preach for 45 minutes, he's like, you're going to write a sermon that takes the congregation on this journey with you for 45 minutes. This was back when I worked for churches in a completely different life. But if you're going to take the congregation on this journey for 45 minutes, spend a ton of time planning the first 10 minutes and a ton of time planning the last 10 minutes, because that's what they're going to remember. So it's true in storytelling across all mediums, right? Your reader is going to remember the first of the story and the end of the story better than they remember the messy middle. What they will put out in the middle are big emotional turns. So anytime there's a big emotional turn, they're going to remember first the story, they're going to remember last the story, they're going to remember. Your scenes are not created equally, right? Some scenes have bigger impact than others. Once we know that, and we know the scenes are a sequence, when we start kind of like thinking about the shape of our story, whether you do that before you write and you're a big planner, or you're a pantser, you're just going to write the story and then figure this out after you write it, and you're going to figure this out in the editing process. At some point, you're going to have to consider the shape of your story by looking at each scene and how the character is changing in each scene. Um, and yeah, it just it helps to know that when you hit a scene with a big major emotional turn, there's going to be greater change in your character there. Your character is going to flash higher positive or higher negative net change. All right. So that's the theory behind scenes. So we've got these scenes that have around character change. So we've got these scenes that are lined up in a sequence. In each scene, we've got three. Oop, I skipped it. We've got three tools, three ways to show your reader that the character's changing. So every scene, you got three ways to show your reader's character's changing. Number one, how your character's voice modulates. If you're a dialoguer, I bet you could have guessed that one. Number one, how your character's voice modulates in a scene demonstrates how the character is changing. Line all those scenes up, line all those modulations up. How your character sounds at the beginning of the book is different than how your character sounds at the end of the book. Communicates change. Character voice modulating communicates change. Second way, choices the character makes, right? And this pairs with the modulation because our choices are emotional choices. So the choices the character's making in every scene communicates how the character is changing. If the character is making, if you want the character to grow in maturity throughout the book, let's say it's a coming of age story and the character needs to grow through maturity in the book. As the character makes choices, ideally, they're going to show some signs of wisdom and maturity in some of their choices. And when they make a wise or mature choice, as the reader, we're going to go, oh, look at that growth. I like that growth. That growth feels good. And then they make a stupid choice. And when they make a stupid choice, we're like, oh, we're back to the net negative choices. No, you've changed for the negative again, right? Like, so that's if the shape of the story is a story um of coming of age and of like maturing, right? Like, so the choices your character makes in every scene communicates how the character's changing throughout the story. The third thing is how people respond to your character, right? How the other characters respond to your character can be a tool to communicate character change. I'm going to break down each one of these so that we can get a little bit closer look at these tools and how to use them. So the first one, voice modulation. Now, if you're a long-term dialoguer, you're gonna be like, wait, Jeff, you've got on this slide 5 components of character voice, but there's only 4. When we started the dialoguer, I started saying character voice is made up of words, body language, cadence, and pacing. But when I do that, I'd have to say character voice is made up of words, which is the vocabulary of the character and the topics the character chooses to talk about. And I've just gotten to a place, especially when I was writing the book, where I'm tired of saying words, the vocabulary, and the topics. So we're just going to say from now on, the character's voice is made up of the vocabulary and the topics, and we're going to skip the middleman with this word words. So five ways the characters, 5 things that make up a character's voice. Vocabulary the character uses, the topics the character speaks, the character's body language is part of the character's voice. And then I used to say cadence, and then I'd immediately have to explain what cadence is. So instead of saying that, I'm going to say the rhythm of a character's utterance. So again, I talk about scene construction in other episodes, but scene construction, I talk about dialogues, mechanics on the page in other episodes. I'm not going to get deep into it right now. But just know that the give and take of characters is called an exchange. So if you got character A, B, and C talking to each other, character A, character B, character C, like character A says something, character B says something, character C says something, that's one exchange, right? Then character A talks, then character B talks. That's exchange number 2. Then character A talks, then character C talks. That's exchange 3, right? Like, so the characters give and take, usually indicated by a character repeating, right? Like a character saying something else, the beginning and end of it as a character a character coming in again. The character's exchange is broken up into utterances. So each character, what character A says is character A's utterance. What character B says is character B's utterance. Character C says is character C's utterance. So again, part of the reason I'm changing language is to enforce language I use in other places, because I realized I was saying like, oh, the cadence and the pacing, and then I was having to explain utterance and exchange. So let's just get right to utterance and exchange. So vocabulary, topics, body language, rhythm of utterance, and rate of exchange. And by rate of exchange, I mean how often does the character enter those exchanges that are happening in the dialogue? When there's three characters, does character C come in every other time? Character A speaks, character C, character B, character C, character A, character C, character B, character C, character B, character C, character A, character C. That's a big rate of exchange, right? Like that character talks a lot. Character C is in that conversation all the time. If we have a shyer character, right, or a character that's less confident, or maybe a character that's more observant and listens more than they talk, then they may not come in every exchange. They may come in every fourth. So we get character A, character B, character A, character B, character A, character B, character C. Character B, character A, character B, character A, character C, character B, character C, character A, character B, character A, character B, character C, right? Like that's a lower rate of exchange. That character C is coming in less in those exchanges. So character voice, vocabulary, topics, body language, rhythm of an utterance, and rate of exchange. Those are the new terms I'm using. If dialoguers want to yell at me about those terms, you're like, no, I like the old ones better. Come into the Slack, yell at me in the Slack. I'm always there. You can yell at me in the Slack all you want. Or if you're not part of the Slack, yeah, you can just join the Patreon and then you can yell at me in the Slack. It works too. All right, so 5 components of a character voice. Now, when our characters have an emotional experience, an emotional shift is caused by all kinds of things, right? Like sometimes an emotional shift is caused by an emotional shift. The character moves from happy to sad. The character gets excited about something, right? Like we can define an emotional shift that way. Or an emotional shift might come because the character is more or less comfortable, right? In more comfortable times, the character is going to become more vulnerable. And when the character is uncomfortable, they may close up some or become more guarded in the topics that they talk about and the language, the vocabulary that they use, right? A role change can also be an emotional shift, right? Like I remember when my dad would be at home talking to us at the dinner table, he kind of had one emotional ethos about him. He was comfortable. He would be a little more vulnerable. And then, but he was also always trying to teach us something as kids. So he kind of had that like teaching emotional persona going on where he's like observing and looking for things. His voice sounded one way there, but then I'd go to the hospital with him. He'd put on that white coat and all of a sudden he was Dr. Elkins, the surgeon. And as Dr. Elkins, the surgeon, he had a completely different emotional state, right? There he's in charge and he's directing. So his voice would modulate, right? Because of that emotional shift he was experiencing by the changing of role. Emotional shifts also happen when we're talking to different conversation partners. I'm more comfortable with my wife. I feel differently talking to my wife than I do talking to the cashier at my local Target. So if I talk to the cashier at my local Target like I talk to my wife, that's going to be weird. It feels like an SNL sketch where I'm like saying too much to the person at Target. But if I talk to my wife, like I talk to the cashier at Target, my wife is going to be like, this is weird. This whatever emotional tone you have happening right now does not match our relationship, right? Like, so voice modulation happens because of shifts in emotional tone based on our comfort, our role, our conversation partner, or just the circumstances, the situation we're in. Right now, when we get that emotional shift, we've got these 5 components of a character voice, right? The vocabulary the character has, the topics the character uses, the body language, the rhythm of the character's utterances, or the rate of the character's exchange. We've got these 5 pieces. As emotional tones shift, some of those aspects of the voice might change. Now, it's rare that you're going to change all of them in one scene. That like all of us, it would take a big emotional shift to change all of these in one scene. So I have one of my coaching clients writes action, and she has a character who is I would say their language is very simple. They use kind of simple words, small words. They're not very pretentious, so they're very like down to earth. So their vocabulary in that first part of a component of a character voice, their vocabulary is very direct, simple, small words. The topics they choose are always around the present. They don't talk a lot about the future. They never dwell on the past. They're always focusing on the present. And the body language they use is very tight, right? There's a lot of crossing of arms, and there's a lot of eye contact. They make a ton of eye contact. Their utterances are usually a sentence or two with periods at the end, and then their rate of exchange, they get highly involved in conversations. So they're usually in every exchange, especially even in a big cast scene, right? But when they get to battle mode, and they shift out of that normal voice into battle mode, it's a big emotional shift, right? Like they're going from this kind of strategic mode that they're always in to then they have this big emotional shift where guns are firing and people are dying and things are happening in war, and we have a big emotional shift. So in that huge emotional shift, yeah, four of the five change, right? The vocabulary they're using is the same, but the topics they talk, well, and the topics, so only three out of the five change because the topics are still based on the present. Utterances become much shorter, right? The rhythm of the utterance is much shorter, and there's all periods, sometimes exclamation points, because they're just yelling commands, right? Body language becomes much more aggressive because they're doing things in the battle that are more aggressive. And the exchange rate, actually the exchange rate will slow a little bit because they give space for other people to communicate what's going on. So that's an example of a high modulation. And you can see even in that really big emotional shift of modulation, I'm only modulating three of the five, right? Like, so it's rare. It's really rare that you're going to modulate all five of your characters' voice components at one time. The other thing you need to think about as you're modulating voice components is that your character needs to stay true to who they are. So if your character has a shy personality, it just because they're shy with their barista, right? So the vocabulary they're using is small words because they don't want to draw attention to themselves, so they choose the small word over the big word. The topics they're using um, are topics about other things. They don't like to talk about themselves. They talk about other things, not themselves. The body language they're using is tight. So they've got their hands in their pockets. They're looking down a lot because they don't want to draw attention to themselves. And their body language tries to make them as small as they possibly can be. They're not doing any big gestures. They're not waving at anybody, right? Like everything is small. The utterances, the rhythm of their utterances, the sentences are small and they're just one sentence at a time. And then the rate of exchange is very low, right? Like they're not going to be involved in a lot of exchanges because, again, they don't want to draw attention to themselves. So maybe just one exchange per segment, right? A segment is a grouping of exchanges by topic. So maybe just once per topic that people are talking about, they're going to insert themselves into the conversation, right? Like that's a shy character's voice. Let's say we modulate that character to talking to their best friend. So there's an emotional shift, right? When they're talking to their best friend, they're a little more vulnerable and they're a little more open. That doesn't mean that they're suddenly going to become confident and that they're going to have like six sentences per utterances and now they're all run-on sentences with a lot of commas. It doesn't mean that like all of a sudden they're talking every exchange. They're just like blah blah blah. Like all of a sudden they're the life of the party. They're entering into every exchange. It doesn't mean that their vocabulary radically changes, right? Like our modulation takes steps from the core voice of the character, the core voice being that expression of their personality. The modulation based on the emotional state of the character takes kind of a step away from that core voice, but it doesn't radically change um, because our characters need to stay true to who they are, even though they're changing. So there's not this like in a scene, in a lone scene, there's not radical change. Now, we're talking about change across a story, right? Your character can go from shy to confident across the story. but you're going to have to walk it step by step. You're going to have to show us that character becoming confident through the slow, well, maybe not too slow, but through the progressive, there we go, that's the word I'm looking for. Through the progressive modulation of that sequence of scenes, you're going to have to show that character becoming more confident. So let's say that your book takes place, let's say you're writing an epic fantasy and your book takes place over 100-year period and you have an elf that you're going to follow for 100 years. Yeah, you can take that elf from shy to confident. You got tons of time to do that in, right? And remember, time is the measure of change. So the more time you have, the more change you can measure, right? So with the scenes, the sequence of scenes, you can show that character lining up. Now, I will say there is a danger here in that, like my last, and I'll use myself as an example of somebody who failed at this. My last book, Inside Outside, one of the characters moves from being very internal and unable to speak up for himself to in the end being able to speak up for himself. And I designed at the beginning a very large character leap. It's like I knew I wanted to take the character from like this silent, passive, internal character to this active, big character. And I'm lining up the change to the sequences, right? Like as the book progresses, you can see him having moments of victory and moments of failure. There's net positive moments, there's negative moments through the scenes, and finally those scenes all culminate in big positive character change for him. Because the character change I wanted was so big, that book is 130,000 words. But I needed more time to show the length of that change. Right? So just know the bigger the change in your character, the more time you're going to have to take up with the pages, right? So just think about that. Think about if your character is going to have a personality shift that you're going to display through voice modulation, you're going to need more time on the page. All right. So modulating the character's voice based on the emotional state of each scene is a way that we can show character change in a scene. When we line up that sequence of scenes, we get the net character change through the voice modulation. Second tool you have to demonstrate to demonstrate character change is the choices the character makes. So in every scene, you have to have some kind of conflict. I'm using the word conflict from the book Three Story Method by Jay Thorne and Zach Bohannon. Fantastic book on how to write a story and like the structure of story. And they point out that every story, every part of every story, and every scene in every story needs conflict. Right. Now, that doesn't mean that it needs to be somebody fighting. It means that there needs to be something that pushes the character to make a decision. The characters need to be making active decisions in every scene. So that conflict pushed the character to make an active decision in every scene. The character can make decisions that demonstrate positive change, or the character can make decisions that demonstrate negative change. How the characters choose to behave in the scenes, the choices the characters make, communicate how the character is changing over time. So if you're writing, again, let's do a coming of age book, you want your character making these wise choices, right? You're writing a coming of age book, and the character knows that he has to take the SAT tomorrow. He's got a big exam tomorrow that's going to determine his future. We're at the beginning of the book, and he hasn't learned yet that he needs to be responsible. And so his buddy's like, "Yo, bro, the SAT's not till 6 a.m. tomorrow morning. Come out and party with us." And the character's like, "I could party." Right? Because the character's not making positive changes yet. So the character makes the choice, does terrible in the test, right? Maybe there's another test later on in your story, and we've experienced your character learning some things, changing some things. We've seen their voice modulating. You've given us hints of wisdom and growth through their voice modulating to be more responsible in the topics they choose to talk about. And in like the vulnerability of the topics they choose to talk about. And now they again have the choice to make about whether or not to party before the SAT. And they're like, you know what? I'm not going to do it. I'm going to go get a good night's sleep. That choice has demonstrated character change. See how that works? So the choices your characters make in a scene. And I know that was a stupid example. but it's I'm not writing literature here. I'm trying to like give you examples that are easy to understand. So they're gonna be stupid. So that just know that up front. I'm saying this because I'm self-conscious about the fact that that was a stupid example. And if I like would have pitched, okay, I got a book about a character that takes the SAT, or pitch that, you'd be like, no, no, I don't want to read that. I know. So, but it's about the principle, not about the actual story. I'm going to stop being self-conscious. So the choices the character makes based on the conflict the character experiences in every scene communicate how the character is changing. In that scene, we communicate the choice the character is making. Those choices lined up across the sequence of change communicate how the character's changed over time. Third tool you have voice modulation, you have the choices the character makes in every scene. The third tool you have to communicate change is how the other characters respond to your vehicle character. So I'm thinking specifically, the story that comes to mind is A Knight's Tale. And if you haven't seen A Knight's Tale with Heath Ledger, I'm about to spoil it. So you may want to fast forward 2 minutes. So we see character growth in that. So there's four characters, there's four vehicle characters in A Knight's Tale, three and a half, because one of them doesn't show up till the middle of the movie. Um, but there's a cohort of four characters, and we see growth from all four characters. The lead character is played by Heath Ledger, and he shows the most character change throughout the story. I said I wouldn't say character growth, and here I am saying character growth. He shows the most character change throughout the story. So at the start of the story, the theme is, can Heath Ledger climb the social ladder? Can he, quote unquote, change his stars? So we see him at the beginning making an attempt right off the bat to change his stars. Now it's foolish, right? It's not wise. It's unstrategic. And he's really aggressive in his voice, and he puts his friends in danger. Right. Like, so the way that he's going about it is bad. That's the theme, though. But we're getting the worst version of himself because we're constantly shown around the people around Heath Ledger, specifically around his anchor, that you can change your stars in an elitist way that punishes other people around you and that is selfish and that is not about others. And then we get other moments, right, specifically inside Heath Ledger's cohort, where you can change your stars in a net positive way, right, in a way that acts as a servant who sacrifices for others. We get a big moment where Heath Ledger has to make a decision, right? And he realizes that he's about to joust against a priest who's incognito. And he could withdraw, because withdrawing actually benefits him as an elitist. Now, it would hurt his cohort because they wouldn't earn any money from the joust, and it would actually hurt the prince because the prince wants to joust. So Heath Ledger instead does the selfless thing and does the joust with the prince. And he says right before he does it, I'm doing this for him. He wants to be here. He wants to do this. He wants to compete. I'm going to do this kind of as a way to serve him. So we get that selfless act showing us, hey, this is what could be possible for him. In the coming to the big climax of the movie, we get like, oh, this is the best version of Heath Ledger, where he's back home with his blind father and he's fixing his blind father's roof, right? And he even says, I'm a knight, they're screaming my name, but I'm not too good to climb up on my father's roof and fix it, right? Like, he verbally expresses like, hey, this is the best version of myself. I have climbed the social ladder, but I haven't forgotten where I've come from, and I'm still selfless, right? Like, so now, to reinforce that character change, he's arrested, he's put in the stocks. We get the like Dark Night of the Soul where he's trapped in the stocks, and people are like throwing vegetables at him and yelling about him. And all of a sudden, the prince that he helped before emerges from the crowd and says, no, I have discovered, quote unquote, that he has royal blood and that he is a knight. And I declare him to be a knight, and there's nothing any of you can do about it. The prince is expressing verbally how he is seeing Heath Ledger's character, how his opinion of Heath Ledger's character has changed. He's expressing the change that Heath Ledger has gone through. And he even lists off the qualities of a knight, right? Like he's noble, he's loyal to his friends, and his friends love him, and he tilts when he should yield, right? Like it's this big expression of I can see the character change. This is a tool you can also use in your story. You can bring out a character that expresses, I have seen you change. It happens a lot in fantasy stories where the king is finally revealed, right? Like I'm thinking of Lord of the Rings, where Strider is revealed to become Aragon and people bow, right? Like they take a knee in front of the king, right? Like it's this big revelation of like, oh, the king is here. We're going to take a knee. It happens also in like romance stories, right? Where the character who is so selfish that they can't love is having a conversation with the best friend, and the best friend knows, man, you've really changed. You are different, right? Having the best friend note that is a tool you can use to communicate to your reader, the character is changing, right? Like, so you've got three. So to recap, we've got this story that is time over the story. It's a sequence of scenes. Throughout the sequence of scenes, we want to show the best version of our character, the worst version of our character, to confuse the reader, right? The reader doesn't know where we're going. Best version of our character, worst version of our character, until the ends of the reader's surprise. We want to show them both of the options through the sequence of scenes. In order to show that character change through each scene, we've got three tools: voice modulation, the choices the characters make, and how other characters talk about our character. And if you want to get real sciencey about it, you can take your timeline of your story, you can put a dash for each scene, and you can kind of mark on there like, okay, what's the net positive change and what's the net negative change, right? You can be like, all right, so the choice they made was really good and their modulation shows positive character growth at this scene, and then the next scene they're gonna make a stupid choice and they're gonna have selfish modulation, right? Like their voice is going to modulate so that they only care about themselves. We're going to do like three of those in a row, right? And if you start plotting out your scenes that way, you can start to see the shape of your story take place. Not necessary. I don't actually think it's science. There's part of me, part of my analytical side that wants to be like, all right, I'm going to rate whether this change is a 1, a 2, or a 3, like how big this change is, or if it's a -1, a -2, or a -3. And then I'm going to plot it out and I'm going to get the exact line for my story. So that's all nice and good, except that you can't actually control how big your reader thinks that change is. Right? Like you can control how you perceive it. You can't control how your reader perceives it. So you're like +3 might be a +10 for your reader. You're like +4 might be a +1 for your reader. So I do think that in general, you can tell when it's a positive or negative impact of change, but I think it's real hard to start to gradiate those things. So my advice, keep it loose. Don't get lost in the math. I don't know that it's worth it. Now, there might be some editors that are like, no, Jeff, you are dumb. I can put it in numbers. That's awesome. I'm incapable. I can't do that. I can't get lost in the math. But if you can, more power to you. Anyway, the main point is you can start to tell the shape of your story by these positive and negative scene changes, right? Like, and then we know by the end if the character has changed in a positive way or in a negative way by the shape of the story. Let's talk for a second about the shape of your story. There are 1,000 different shapes of stories, right? You can actually shape your story any way you want. You can have peaks and valleys across this timeline of your story. It can look like any wave on a line that you want it to look like. You can have as many ups and downs as you want. It's art, right? It's art. At the same time, like I said at the beginning, there are also expectations. It is art, but there are expectations, especially in genre. So if you're writing genre fiction, fiction that is specific to a certain genre, and it's not like lit fic or something else more broad, and it's like conventions, uh, in conventions, expectations, same word. Um, you got to know that your reader's showing up for a certain emotional experience, right? If you're writing romance, your reader has expectations of the shape of that story and of how your characters are going to change, right? The character who is too busy for love needs to learn to slow down so they can find love. The character who is too burdened by the world around them needs to be able to let some of those burdens go so they also can find love, right? Like your reader showing up with a specific shape of story subconsciously in their mind. You do not have to match the shape of that story. There are no rules. But when you defy reader expectations, you make your work harder. It's as if you're a painter and you know the people coming to your gallery love realism. In fact, they love realistic paintings about sailboats. You are actually putting your paintings in an art gallery that only sells realistic paintings about sailboats. That's what they sell, right? And the art gallery owner told you before you brought your paintings in, he was like, hey, look, I'm excited about hanging your paintings, but you need to know the paintings that sell are realistic paintings of sailboats. You're like, yeah. I have an abstract art about an orange. Am I saying you won't find a buyer in that art gallery for your abstract art of an orange? I'm not saying that. I'm just saying you made it harder for yourself by putting that abstract orange in an art gallery that only sells paintings of sailboats. Speaking as somebody, like speaking as a fiction writer who has never been able to hit genre conventions because I just can't help myself. And yes, it has impacted my sales. Speaking as that person, do not do what I do if you're gonna write in a genre that has high expectations, that has strong conventions. You can do whatever you want. You can make your story shape whatever you want, but just know your reader has a specific shape unconsciously in mind. And if you're going to break that shape, you got more work to do to keep them engaged. Let's talk about story shapes. So if your character starts at a net negative, everything about your character is terrible, right? They are, this is the Christmas story, and they are Scrooge. They're mean to Bob Cratchit. Bob Cratchit is like, can I have some money for Tiny Tim to have a turkey for Christmas? And you're like, no, earn more, work harder if you want more money. Don't put so much coal in the fire. I like it cold in here, right? Like if you're gonna have this terrible character at the beginning of the story, and then at the end of the story, we're just gonna have a very clear arc where every scene he's meeting a ghost, and that ghost is changing him a little bit, and his voice is modulating through. He's going through a modulation of concern at first and denial, and then he's going through a modulation of anxiousness and worry, and that encourages us because it's an upward slope, right? Like if he's worried about things, maybe he'll change. And then finally, at the end of the story, he's celebrating. He's running through the streets and he's buying everybody turkeys and he's saying, Merry Christmas, right? Like giant modulation from, Scrooge to Scrooge at the end, where he's like not Scrooge anymore. He's like now Christmas Scrooge. Huge modulation, right? In character voice. The choices he makes along the way change with every ghost that he talks to. That is an upward slope of story shape, right? We start at the bottom of our timeline, we move all the way up to the top, and it's a feel good story, classic feel good story. You can also have a downward slope, right? Let's say you start with two star-crossed lovers. They're young kids. They don't know any different. And when they talk to each other, they say things like, your eyes are like the stars. No, they're the moon, and they shine so bright they enchant me at night, right? Like they have these like deep poetry where they're like giving their utterances, their like rhythm of their utterance is just like a page of poetry about the topics they're choosing to talk about, are the eyes of their love and how beautiful their cheekbones are and how their voice is like a song, right? Like we're starting off super positive and everything's happy, and then as the story goes on and they face a lot of conflict around their relationship and they don't handle it well, right? Like instead of like just talking to their parents, they plot and scheme amongst each other and they decide that there shall be no change ever and the world is against them. And they start to talk more about how the world is against them and their topics modulate and change and the rhythm of their utterances modulate and change. And they're like now they're not giving sonnets about the beauty where the lines and lines and lines of poetry. There's utterances become smaller as they face the anxiety and worry of what's happening and then face kind of hopelessness and then finally decide that like no, they have to escape the world. There's no possibility they can exist in the world. And all the time we're reading we can see the tragedy forming in the shape of the story is a downward line. There's not a lot of moments of hope. We're just gonna get sad and then they die at the end, right? Like that's a tragedy. So you can have that downward slope. Say normal like hero's journey is that we start at kind of a neutral place in the world before there's a conflict that happens. That conflict usually our characters don't handle well, right? Like just like I was describing in the Knight's Tale, classic hero's journey. Our character has moments, they'll have peaks during the messy middle where they do things well, like in the fun and games we get like a little glimpse of what our character of the positive way our character could look at the end. But then we dip down again where our character fails and the bad guys return. We have a dark night of the soul where our character is kind of at their lowest point. We express that through sadness in their modulation. We express that through hopelessness in the choices that they're making. But then they rally, they come together as a team, and the shape of the story is positive on the net end in the big climax when they battle the big bad. This is the standard hero's journey. It's what we see in the Save the Cat type story shape. It's a shape you can choose. You can also invert that story shape, especially if you're telling a villain tale like Cruella, like we mentioned at the beginning, right? Where we're going to start at a neutral to positive place, right? Like in Cruella, we start with her as a baby, and we see her facing challenge after challenge, making choices that are pretty positive, right? She gathers a community around her, two guys. She ventures out into the city, right? Like we see her voice modulating, where she actually seems like a pretty positive person, but then she starts to engage. And as she starts to engage and getting this power struggle with the woman she's working for, we see her making choices that are more negative and that we don't necessarily like, right? Like, and her voice modulates to become meaner. She starts snapping at the men that she's gathered around her, right? Like she starts lashing out at her own community until finally, at the end of the story, she is the version that we didn't want. She's mean to her friends, and her friends are no longer her friends, they're now her servants, and she's a little power crazy. And yes, she's won the day, she's claimed the power she wanted to have, but her voice is modulated, and the choices she's made has isolated her and made her more alone. So it's a net negative in the end, right? Like even though it's a power winning story and she gains autonomy and strength, she does it um, by becoming more like the negative character that we wanted her not to become like. So she, in the end, becomes her antagonist or she becomes her anchor. So we get that like negative net. Yeah, so that's just another shape of the story you'd have. Now, whenever I'm talking about shape of the story, I think I mentioned this at the beginning. People are like, there are characters, Jeff, that don't change, right? There's the sniper character. He doesn't change. I can't remember his name. I've read a couple of the books, but I can't remember his name. Or there's Lee Childs as Jack Reacher. Jack Reacher never changes, never changes. Um, that's not true. We'll push back hard. It's not true. Now, there's a net zero. So the characters start and end at the same place, but there's definitely change in every scene. And there is a positive version of the character we see and a negative version of the character we see all the way through. I think the cleanest example of this is from the TV show The A-Team, not the movie, the TV show from the 80s and 90s. I was born in the late 70s. I grew up watching The A-Team. If you've never seen The A-Team, the plot of every episode is the same. It is about a group of like super soldiers. One of them's like super planner. He's like super smart. One of them's like flies the helicopter and knows how to work machines, but he's a little wacky and crazy. One of them's like super strong, but he also has like weird fears, like he hates flying. And then one of them's super charismatic, right? Like they're these super soldiers. So And they used to be this elite unit that used to do great things, and then they got framed in the military, and now they're on the run from the military. So that's like the premise of the story. That's where we start, right? They're isolated, they're on the run, they're alone. Every episode, they show up into a town that has a huge bully, and the town needs their help, right? But at the beginning, we get the worst version of the characters, specifically, usually Hannibal, who's like, we can't help. We're on the run. We have to keep going. We've got to leave these people behind. We cannot stay and help them, right? We get the worst version of the characters. The choices the characters are making communicate to us that, oh, we want these characters to change. The voice modulates so that the topics they talk about, the way that they talk about the town is a negative in our opinion. But then at some point, the heartstrings are pulled, and one of the four characters stands up and is like, no, we have to stay. We have to help. These bullies can't happen. And then they start making different choices, and their voices start to modulate in different ways. They're kinder to the people of the town. They start planning, right? Like the topics they talk about change. And now they're like going to the scrapyard, and they're like finding scrap metal, and they're going to build a tank out of scrap metal to stand up to the bullies, because that's what every small town needs, is super special elite soldiers to show up and build a tank out of scrap metal in the junkyard to take on the town bully and knock down the town bully. And in the end, they win, right? Like, or they have to run some kind of con, and they win in the end, and they help the people that really needed help. But after we have this huge victory moment, we're like, yay, they've won, and we love them. They've made positive choices. Their voices have modulated to make them more vulnerable. Their voices have modulated to give them connection to the people of this town. They say, but we're on the run, and we got to go back out there. We can't stay. We'll endanger you if we stay. We got to go. We got to. And their voices go back to where they were at the beginning, and again they're isolated, and again they're alone, and the choices they make send them back on the run, even though they don't want to be. So we start and end at the same place. There's change all throughout the story, but it is a net zero beginning and the end, because we start and end at the same place. But it doesn't mean there's not change. It just means it's a net zero, right? Like we start and end at the same place. So yeah, there is change in those stories. There is character change in those stories. The character just chooses at the end to go back to who he was at the beginning. If you're listening to this and you're not watching my slides, you can get them later in the newsletter. But what I have on the screen right now is just kind of a wacky wave that goes in all kinds of directions and has a lot of humps. And I put this on here just to restate. There are no rules. There's just expectations of readers. And you're an artist. Make the wave you want to make. Just know that the genre you're writing in has an expected wave, right? So it doesn't say you can't change that wave. It just says, just be aware of what you're doing as an artist. If they're expecting realistic sailboats and you show up with an abstract orange, it might be tough for you. All right. Final summary. So I know a lot of us are doing NaNoWriMo right now. It's November when I'm recording this. So a lot of us are doing NaNoWriMo, and we're like fast writing a book, and we're thinking about how our character changes when we're writing a book. So here is 4 questions you can ask while you're writing that will help you consider all the questions that we talked about today. The first question: who's the character at the beginning of your story? Keep in mind that flaw. That if you want a net positive, it helps to start them with something that needs to change. If you have a Superman character at the beginning of the story, it's really tough to change Superman by the end of the story. That's one of the problems with Superman stories, by the way, is that Superman is already perfect at the beginning of the story. Where are we gonna go? You got to go the dark Superman. You got to make him sad and bad. Or you have a net zero Superman. Anyway, he has to experience change throughout the story, though. Or no time passes if nothing changes. So, who's your character at the beginning of the story? Keep in mind that you want to set them up with that flaw, that either net positive or net negative flaw that's gonna change throughout the story. Second question: who is the character at the end of your story? Right? How are they going to change? Keep in mind your theme. Right? Whatever theme you want to write to, try to base their change around that theme. So, who's the character at the end of the story? Third question: what's the shape of your story? If the character's starting low and ending low, Then in the middle somewhere, we got to have a big like, oh, this is the positive version of the character that we're going to reap down because we need some kind of change, right? Like we need some kind of movement. Characters starting high and ending low. That's more like characters starting low and ending high. If we're going to start neutral and then kind of go through a bunch of different waves to get to the end. But what is the shape of your story? And again, if you're writing genre, what's the expected shape of your story? Last question. How are you building that shape scene by scene? Right? So you want to be thinking about that sequence of scenes, right? And how change is happening in every scene. How is the character's voice modulating in every scene, building to that final modulation? What are the choices the character's making in every scene? And when we got big scenes where you really want to express change, what other character you bringing in to talk about? Man, look at how you've changed. Look at how great it is, right? Like use those engines and anchors and hazard characters to point out to your vehicle how change is happening. That also points out to your reader how change is happening. All right. I hope this was helpful. I hope you got something out of it. If you have any questions, you can come to dialoguedoctor.com and ask me. Or, if you're in the Slack, you can just ask me in the Slack. We can talk about it there. I will do a bonus episode this week to lay out this a little bit more. Uh, I think that's it, y'all. Happy writing this week. Go get it. Get those words on page. Do the thing. Put the butt in the seat and do the thing. I'm going to try to do that too. And yeah, I hope you get a lot done and you go tell that story you want to tell. The world needs it. And I will see you again next week. Bye, y'all.